historically, many of the great men of science loved God. They loved God. So they had the greatest commandment that Jesus was challenged with in that one critical moment of his ministry when they were trying to trap him. And this one guy comes up and he's unnamed in scripture and he says, what's the greatest commandment? And they really think they've got him, right? And he does not pause. He's like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second, which you didn't ask for, by the way, is love your neighbor as yourself. Once upon a time, science was built, innovation was had, and discoveries were made because there were great men who were basing all of their scientific research on the glory of God and the love of neighbor, the good of mankind.
Welcome to the show called Let's Talk Homeschool, brought to you by Apologia Educational Ministries. This is the show where we talk about everything homeschooling, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. We want to affirm and encourage you in the decision to homeschool, challenge and inspire you to take it to new heights, and celebrate everything you get to experience in this adventure of a lifetime. We are your hosts, Davis and Rachael Carman, and today's show is titled Population Bomb.
Yep.
All right, Rachael, let's talk homeschool. So I'll give a little bit of history leading up to the main topic here of population bomb. In the late 1700s, 1798 to be exact, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Malthus published a book titled The Essay on the Principles of Population. And you may have heard of Malthusian theories or Malthusian fears. It's all from Thomas Malthus. And part of his theory in the late 1700s, when the world's population was 1 billion, it had just reached that level, and he said that there was going to be mass starvation, the world couldn't sustain the population growth, and we were going to see famines, starvation like never before, and it was going to be horrible and awful. And that created these Malthusian fears that we even still talk about today. Well, that was in the 1790s. You continue to the 1960s when the world's population got up to 3 billion.
Right.
And a gentleman by the name of Paul Ehrlich wrote a new book entitled Population Bomb, which is the title of this podcast. And basically he regurgitated all of Thomas Malthus's theories that now the world's population is 3 billion.
Yep.
There's going to be mass starvation, famines left and right. The world's population cannot be sustained with the technology that existed at this point, which was obviously more advanced than the 1790s.
Right.
But even Paul Ehrlich believed that we were headed to a horrible place very, very soon. Mm-hmm. Here we are in 2024, 225 years after Thomas Malthus and 50 plus years after Paul Ehrlich, with 8 billion people in the world.
Right.
And we got plenty of food on the shelves in the U.S. There's the population is not experiencing mass starvation and famines at the type of scale that they were all fearing. So what we want to talk about is what is a Christian homeschooler's response to this? Because there are several, I call them religions, going on today related to climate change and abortion and probably a few other subsets of those religions. And they all boil down to the religion of atheism.
Right.
And we've got to protect ourselves from the lies and deception and the throwing out of God in all of this.
Yeah.
So why don't you go ahead and give some of your initial comments to how people are looking at Malthus or Paul Ehrlich or just the population of the world today relative to a Christian homeschooler's view and response and perspective.
Yeah, so I do want to make a caveat. I think that's kind of my job on the podcast. Obviously, there are people in the world that go hungry. There are people in the United States that go hungry. So we're not suggesting that this problem is solved. But I do think if you look at these two men who proposed that we were in dire straits and it was going to be the end of the world, we're really underestimating the innovation of man. They really could not foresee a solution to this. And yet we know as Christians that the Genesis mandate is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Now, I think what we miss in that passage in Genesis, just fill the earth is not just with more people. And this is a really important point that I think gets missed most of the time when this gets talked about. The Genesis mandate given to Adam and Eve was to multiply and fill the earth with the glory of God.
Right.
Because as image bearers of God, we were to take his image into the world and fill the world with his glory. Obviously, we have failed to do that. We've had multiple opportunities to do that. And God in his goodness and his grace and his kindness, right, and his incredible patience with us continues to give us the opportunity to do that. And as Christians, that's what we're charged with to do. So related, not only did these two gentlemen miss it, because, in my opinion, they lacked one primary thing, and that is they weren't focused on the glory of God. And when you kick out God, as many have done, our culture has done, we're in a post-Christian era now, it has ramifications of huge proportion. This is not just, I'm kicking out God, I'm not going to church on Sunday, I'm keeping my tithe. It's not that simple, because if you kick out God, if you determine that you are going to reject all of his love, all of his grace, all of his mercy, and say no to God, it directly influences how you live. And how you live as an individual ends up affecting your community, your city, your state, and culture. And so we can't just continue to believe that we can, as individuals, kick out God without consequence. What we're seeing now is the consequence, because what were we made to do? We were made to worship. And like you said, God made us his image bearers. We're made to worship him, to take his glory out into the world. But when we don't do that, get this, we don't stop worshiping. We still worship something. And like you just said, now the substitute for kicking God out, a lot in all of the social systems, right? Whether it's the school system or institutions, you've got a lot of institutions that no longer want to talk about Christmas. They want to talk about the holidays, which is in itself ironic because holidays means holy days. So they can't even successfully do that. But when you start doing that across the board, you start seeing those implications. Guess what? Across the board. And people start worshiping because they can't not worship, but then they're substituting and worshiping wrong things like self, like the climate. And so instead of, this is all in Romans 1, right? Instead of worshiping the creator, we worship the created. And instead of doing what God instructed Adam and Eve to do, and that was to take charge of creation, right? And to oversee it as stewards, we start bowing down and worshiping it. And we can't control the weather. We can't, and boy, I hope we never can, because that would be a really sad, sad day if we could ever do that.
Well, right. And no, so you mentioned one of the main point, and that is the kicking out of God.
It's huge.
Is the main wrong that Thomas Malthus and Paul Ehrlich and others have done. So, as you know, Apologia is a creation-based science company, and we're not here to say that science is the answer to all the world's problems, but in Thomas Malthus's day, in the late 1790s, there wasn't electricity yet.
Yep.
There wasn't innovation in the farming technology.
Right.
And God allowed innovation and creativity so that man would come up with amazing things that totally changed the world that they couldn't imagine and that weren't even around at the time. Yeah. Now, some of that was around when Paul Ehrlich wrote his book.
Right.
However, that in many ways, that's why his book, Population Bomb, is an even more clear indication of the kicking out of God.
Right.
Because I would think that a thinking person would be able to look at the world going from 1 to 3 billion and the change in technology between that 150 years.
Yeah.
One could forecast and say, I have no idea what innovations are going to come up in the next 150 years as we grow to 10 billion, 12 billion population.
Right.
But I bet God will provide some solutions here that I just can't foresee in my finite mind living in today's world.
Yeah.
Because even right now, with a population of 8 billion, I have no idea how the world's going to be fed when it's twice this size.
Right.
But I firmly believe that God will show man the way and help us figure it out because he wants us to fulfill that creation mandate.
Yeah, but my concern, and I think some of our viewers or listeners would agree with me, my concern is that whereas historically many of the great men of science loved God, they loved God. So they had the greatest commandment that Jesus was challenged with in that one critical moment of his ministry when they were trying to trap him. And this one guy comes up and he's unnamed in scripture and he says, what's the greatest commandment? And they really think they've got him, right? And he does not pause. He's like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second, which you didn't ask for, by the way, is love your neighbor as yourself. Once upon a time, science was built, innovation was had, and discoveries were made because there were great men who were basing all of their scientific research on the glory of God and the love of neighbor, the good of mankind. My concern is there's been a shift. And so many of the scientists that we have today are over here. And they're not doing it for the glory of God. They're not even doing it for the good of mankind. They're doing it for their own glory. And you can see that we're kind of going off the rails scientifically because there's some innovations that we have now that is spinning, in my opinion, out of control. And so I agree that this is the time for us to be reminded as Christian homeschoolers that we got to get back to the basics here. We got to get back to teaching our children what it means to be an image bearer and what it means to take the glory of God into the world and love God and love our neighbor. That's the way forward. It's not just with another reckless innovation. That innovation has got to be focused on the glory of God and the good of mankind, because otherwise we end up using those innovations that could glorify in wrong ways.
Well, right. And some of the thoughts that came to my mind as you were saying that is, what is science?
Yeah.
And it's the exploring of creation and the discovery of God's laws of nature.
Right.
And it's not to have preconceived ideas of how it works, because we
Right.
don't know. We're trying to figure it out. But so often today, people have their preconceived ideas of how they want it to do, how they want it to be.
Right.
And so then they come up with ways for the scientific data to show their case to be true,
Right.
Rather than letting the data lead them to the answers.
Right.
So we want to publish curriculum that's creation-based, that points people to God, their creator, and so that budding scientists can be exactly like what you said.
Exactly.
They can fear God and they can learn and discover and explore this world and understand how God made it work, which then leads to ideas and innovations that help mankind.
Yes.
And that fill the world
Right.
with his glory.
Right.
So that's why, on the flip side, people that have kicked God out are worshiping religions that we would call climate change and abortion, and they're wanting to reduce the world's population as
Right.
the answer, when that's not the answer.
not the
God
answer.
said to fill the earth. And you think about it. For economies to grow, you need more people.
Right.
When economies shrink, when populations shrink,
Right.
the economy gets hurt.
Exactly.
And so actually, I believe, with a Christian worldview, that more people on the world will actually help us feed those more people much better than less people.
Well, and I think also we haven't even talked about the importance of depending on God, right? I think part of the social over here anti-God science thrust is this underlying, but don't ignore it, desire to prove that we don't need God. That as man, we're smarter than God, that we've got this, that we can kick him out. When over here, again, you had great men of God who were persisting in their desire to honor God and to help mankind. And that is what we've got to get back to. I think it honors God. And this is a scary thing. This is a scary thing. And I think when some people hear this, they're like, I don't want that kind of a God. But hear me out. It honors God when we acknowledge our dependence on him. It honors him when we don't know, right? Because I know just in my own life, there's been, had 1,000 chameleon different problems and issues and challenges in my life that I couldn't solve, right? I love the quote by Abraham Lincoln, which I will not get exactly right, but he said he has been struck by how many times he had to go to his knees because there was nowhere else to go. Oh, that would be true for us, that we would spend more time going to him because we can't figure it out. Because when we dare to go to him and tell him that we need him, we've got a solution. We need to feed the masses, or we need to figure out the logistics of getting the food to the masses, or we need to figure out what to do about this disease or this economic problem. It honors him for us to go to him because then he gets to show off to us, right? He gets to outpour his love and his kindness and his creativity to us so that we as image bearers can take his glory into all the world. I mean, that's as it should be. But over here, it's just this determination to prove we don't need him.
Right.
So as believers, as image bearers, one of the things I think we can do in our homes is acknowledge our needs, whether it is the next mortgage. We've been in that situation where we're unemployed, or it's a problem we've got at work, or maybe with a family member. When we model to our kids that we depend on God to show us the way, that is training our kids to be good image bearers. That's showing our kids what it's like to take his glory into all the world and to honor him in word and deed.
Well, right. And the last comment I'll make is related to climate change specifically, which I believe is the outplay of Malthus and Ehrlich.
Yeah.
The current day climate change activists are the Malthusians of today. Right. And part of what they're doing, besides kicking God out, is they're coming up with predetermined conclusions rather than following the data.
Right.
Now, there's already many scientists across the world that are pushing back, saying the data does not lead there.
Right.
Now, there's plenty of things that are true that the climate change people are saying, but there's several things that aren't true. And so looking at the data, trying to discover, and then, as you said, depending on God.
Yep.
Because as I look at what's happening, and I actually really enjoy following the data as an engineer myself, looking at all the temperatures of the world, where the waters on the beaches are moving to and from, the ice caps on the North and South Pole. I actually really enjoy looking at that kind of data and asking critical questions, like where are they taking the temperatures? At the surface level, 10 feet above, 20 feet above, below the earth? How many locations? There's quite a bit of detailed, complicated pieces to this. But I firmly believe we're in God's hands.
Right.
And he's created a very robust world
he has.
that can take care of itself in many ways. Carbon dioxide is not the bad guy any more than oxygen is the bad guy.
Right.
They're in complementary symbiosis together with all of the world. And so I just love how God created a world that's so complicated we can barely predict the weather 7 days in advance. I mean, that's pretty amazing when you look at the models that we have in place and that we can pretty decently forecast 3-4 days out, sometimes a week pretty accurately. But to try and predict what the weather is going to be 40 years from now, we certainly don't have the technology today. And I think that would actually be a little bit scary if man got to that level.
I agree.
Because once again, we want to replace God with ourselves as God and put ourselves on the throne. And that's not where we should be. We should depend on God.
Exactly. Like and another thing that we can do in terms of raising our little image bearers, being good image bearers ourselves, and taking the glory of God into the world, like the Genesis mandate encourages us to do, is we need to be good stewards. We need to be people who are concerned about conservation and taking care of the planet. This is God's world. This is my Father's world, as the hymn says. So as Christians, we ought to be concerned about how well we're taking about how well we're taking care of God's planet. So if we just think, oh, well, this gives me permission to just throw trash out my window and just do whatever I want in God's world, that's not what we're saying. We ought to be more concerned than anybody else, but we're still bowing our knee to God, the Creator, and not to the creation. We're still honoring Him. We're still trusting Him. We're still seeking Him. And we're not chasing off after some scientific answer without Him. But we're all along the way trying to carry His glory, the glory of His creation, and the mandate to take care of it and to do the best for mankind.
Great points. All right. Well, as always, it's time to bring this conversation to a close. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. You can watch us on YouTube. Just search Let's Talk Homeschool, and you'll find us on podcast here in 2024. We hope you join us again next time. This is Let's Talk Homeschool, brought to you by Apologia Educational Ministries, and we are your hosts, Davis and Rachael Carman. Have a great day, and until next time, we are walking by faith and enjoying the homeschooling adventure of a lifetime.